ich wollte zuerst einfach nochmal mein Lob und mein Dank aussprechen, dass ich hier sein darf und dass diese Veranstaltung so toll gelaufen ist, dass es wunderbar organisiert ist und ich also wirklich tolle Menschen hier kennengelernt habe. Vielen Dank. Ich hatte eigentlich ursprünglich Pläne gehabt oder mir versucht, ein paar Gedanken zu machen, was kann ich irgendwie performativ, was kann ich, eine Art Lecture-Performance machen. Dann gab es verschiedene Lebenskrisen, ich war krank und auf Reise in den USA und dann habe ich angefangen, Keith Richards' Autobiography zu lesen und konnte nicht mehr aufhören. Also das Ergebnis davon ist, dass ich doch ein bisschen auf Material zurückgreife, das schon ich eine gewisse Weile mit mir trage und das werde ich auch ein bisschen thematisieren. Ich werde aus verschiedenen Gründen jetzt eine Sprache wechseln und ich hoffe, dass das keine Probleme macht. Oft werde ich seltsamerweise gelobt für meine englische Aussprache, wenn ich das so zugeben darf. Ich hoffe, dass das nicht ablenkt von der Ernsthaftigkeit von dem, was ich versuchen will zu sagen. I have horribly unfinished business with the subject of voice. There are certain themes that one just cannot seem to settle once and for all. Subjects, topics, phenomena, memories that you struggle hard to turn away from, to try and put behind you, but come what may, they keep resurfacing. I keep turning and returning to the subject of voice. Perhaps I should have called this talk The Voice of the Terminator. How to formulate a thesis on voice. How to say something ultimately valid. To build an argument, to defend it logically. To stand up for it, to stand for it. How to catch it, to arrest it, to hold it, to stop it, to keep it in balance. How to think it. This. There are, of course, many, many studies on and of the human voice, like in linguistics and literary analysis and opera studies and even philosophy. And most of them come up with the odd interesting detail or anecdote that is helpful, funny statistics or things about children. But they almost always seem to be like ways of doing away with or avoiding or not hearing the certain weight, or perhaps it's more like a kind of lightness, the infinite intimacy of that which is excruciatingly, sometimes shamefully poised between language and emotion, between talk and song and babble and melody, physical projection and a kind of almost distasteful dance of the body, my voice. The one that first shaped itself in the language of my grandmother, who talked to me with soft, elegant fingers clasped around my little hands, and spoke incomprehensible prayers like mysterious magical music. Like little Lord Jesus, meek and mild, look upon this little child, pity her simplicity and suffer her to come to thee. Recent years have witnessed a significant surge of interest in the human voice and the acoustic, embodied nature of language from a very wide range of different disciplines. Just to conjure for a moment the breadth and variety of these different disciplines. We could talk about an attentiveness to vocality in the theories and methods of linguistics and conversation analysis, or in literary theory, or in cognitive science, or in psychoanalysis, and of course also in the contemporary arts, theatre, music, and performance and film. And not only is this list by no means exhaustive, But the voice in question is not the same. It's not the same voice under all the perspectives. So depending on the angle, various different aspects of the voice will be emphasized. From the point of view of linguistics and conversation analysis, it's above all the relationship between voice and the semantic level of communication, the semiotic character of vocality, which is of interest. Literary theory, on the other hand, tends to focus either on the uniqueness of an author's lyrical voice, or, for instance, drawing on the theories of Bakhtin and others on the polyphony, the multi-voiceness, the heteroglossia, the multitude of layers of different voices that reside within each voice in a literary text are brought to the foreground. And whilst cognitive science has underlined the fundamental role of the sounding voice, the subject's own as well as the voice of others, in the development of consciousness, in psychoanalysis, the patient's voice is perceived as both a symptom and a gateway to the unconscious, insofar as an attentive ear may detect in its disturbances key clues to uncovering the traces of secret trauma buried beneath it or below the surface of the patient's consciousness. And finally, within an artistic or theoretical context, a range of different qualities attributable to the phenomenon of voice are thematized or exploited in actual performance in a whole manifold way, different ways according to the relevance. These qualities range from acoustic resonance, musicality, emotionality or eventness, Ereignishaftigkeit, Theatralität. In other words, the particular temporality of the voice, its ephemeral and elusive presence, ranging from that to the function as a spatial marker, a deictic marker of the now. So, although it's quite absurd to try and sum up or bring into resonance all these different aspects, they're just different, and yet I think it's possible to define a certain sense in which they share a common movement, all these different approaches to voice. It's a movement away from a focus on abstract meaning and text, towards an increased attentiveness to the body, to the acoustic nature of human utterance and communication. Voice comes into its own in all these different realms, not just as a mere carrier of linguistic meaning, but as a material in its own right, with its own substance, its individual grain, as Barthes famously said, and unique dynamic by which the physical, rhythmical, musical, and individual character of spoken communication are perceivable. So any thematization of voice implies an attunement to the manner in which the voice is not just a transparent medium for language, insignificant in itself, but that in its very materiality, a voice may clash with the main propositional content. In this sense, the voice may be revealed as having the potential to show what is not or cannot be said. And it's also in this sense that the voice as a topic of interest for a multitude of disciplines may be considered as a gauge or a marker of the performative turn in the humanities. Now, Austin might have coined the term, yet despite being a philosopher, no one could accuse of lacking voice, because there's an effusive theatricality in most of his texts. Despite his recognition of the ritual dimension of performative language, which implies, of course, a shift towards or from semantics proper to the role of embodied citation, in other words, voice, Austin appears to have paid little attention to the actual role of voice in performative utterances. And yet surely it's not just the words that a priest utters in order for a baby to be baptized or for the couple to be wed that define the success of a performative ritual. It's the quality, tone, and sheer presence and authority, I would like to argue, of the vocal phenomenon that speaks the quasi-magical words that contribute equally essentially to the uncanny power of the always intricately theatrical performative event. Now, last year, there was the news that in Japan, the first couple was actually married by a robot, apparently a female robot called the Eye Fairy. And this fact, or I thought that the fact that this news made it to the headlines around the world somehow confirms the initial assumption that performative acts can generally only be spoken by or carried out by human voices. The words, one could argue, are in a sense but empty placeholders for the voice in such ritualized, ceremonious practices. So anyway, it was with this question of performative language in mind that I originally came to ask about the place of voice in philosophy. Tracing the place of voice in philosophy is a complex and confusing endeavor in which one is led to confront a host of seemingly contradictory perspectives and contradictory conclusions. There are several ways or intertwining routes that one can take. I want to try and make it sound easier than it actually is. So I'll just describe three. One route is to take or to look for the place of tone in philosophy, to consider the often tense relationship between what is said or written and how it's said. So, what a particular philosophy explicitly stands for, how it's said, and what tone can be detected in the writing of a particular philosopher. Does a philosophy reflect its own tonality? Is there a sense in which the voice as meaningful sound can be distinguished, perhaps even perceived to be saying something else, something different than the propositional content? Deconstruction and the reading or listening strategies developed by Derrida and others have clearly sharpened our ears and made philosophers aware of the crucial difference between voice and language and the tendency of the voice to defy conscious, rational control. At the same time, it was also Derrida who pointed to a strong tendency within philosophy to do away with parasitical, what he termed the parasitical element that could be associated with voice. He writes, "Isn't it the dream or the ideal of philosophic discourse to make tonal difference inaudible? And with it a whole desire, affect or scene that works over the concept in contraband? Through what is called neutralité of ton, philosophic discourse must also guarantee the neutralité, or at least the imperturbable sérénité, that should accompagne the relation to the true and to the universel." Another pathway is to consider the place of voice in a particular philosophic system. Here it's a question of attending to what philosophers have explicitly had to say about voice. In other words, their words on voice. Given the metaphysical tradition of Western philosophy and its quest to establish abstract rational ideals over concrete phenomena and emotion, one might initially be inclined to assume that philosophers over the years have tended to overlook or not to hear the significance of the voice beyond its mere function as a vehicle for language. But this is blatantly not true. A host of philosophers have shown interest, indeed at times an uncanny obsession with the voice. So contrarily to what you might expect, the physical, musical aspects of human voice have in fact been very well perceived, not only by the likes of Plato and Aristotle, but also throughout the ages, Lucretius, Saint Augustine, Rousseau, Herder, Humboldt, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida, Nancy. They've all had lots to say about the voice. At least two general movements of thought can be identified that many philosophers have shared when it comes to reflecting upon voice. First, perception of the musicality of language, which naturally goes hand in hand with the perception of the conceptual difference between words and their meanings, or words and their embodied sound, has often tended to attract ambivalent feelings. So the sounding nature of spoken language, or in particular the sounding nature of singing, has often been described by philosophers as something ecstatically beautiful. And yet the same phenomenon has just as often, and often at the same time, been perceived as potentially dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that it is depicted as tempting the senses away from the sober path of reason. In the eyes of many a philosopher, it's almost as if there was something about the medium of voice, as distinct from word, that were potentially mad, or at least maddening. Consider, for instance, this passage taken from Augustine's Confessions. I don't know what his accent might have been like, so... In earlier days, the pleasures of the ear enthralled me more persistently and held me under their spell. But you, Lord, broke my bonds and set me free. Nowadays, I do admittedly find some peaceful contentment in sounds to which your words impart life and meaning, provided the words are sung sensitively by a tuneful voice. But the pleasure is not such as to hold me fast, for if I like, I can get up and go away. Yet sensuous gratification, to which I must not yield my mind for fear it grow languid, often deceives me, when in my own case it happens that the singing has a more powerful effect on me than the sense of what is sung. I confess my sin and my need of repentance, and then I would rather not hear any singer. So he makes a clear distinction here between the aesthetically pleasing sound of the words and their meaning. And it's clearly the meaning side that he associates with divine reason, whereas the sounding aspect, mere noise, is perceived as something to be wary of for fear that one might get carried away by the pleasure of hearing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's references to the sounding nature of language would be another very different example. For him, of course, as is well known, it's the sounding, musical, affective dimension of spoken language, or its dramatic intonation, that is the very holy source of the origin of language, and thereby stands in privileged relation to truth. The more structural, monotonous, grammatical side of language is associated with reason rather than with